Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Andrew Richet. I'm the founder of the Personal Democracy Forum, and today I'm happy to announce that we've changed our name to Personal Democracy Media. After 8 years of working the conference circuit and the blogging circuit, we've decided to become a full-fledged media organization, and we've launched a new site, personaldemocracymedia.com, and a new look for Tech President, for those of you know who about our writing. My job is to do a quick introduction of us and to thank NYU and the Kimmel Center for hosting us. This is another flash conference put together in about 10 days with our small but very dedicated and crackerjack staff, and in cooperation with NYU's Interactive Telecommunications Program, ITP, Clay Shirky's staff and team, Georgia Gudo, and the good folks in his department, and also the team here at Kimmel, John Reimers and Jason Evans, and other NYU Kimmel folks. And lastly, Josette Pearson and the crew from Point Studio for live streaming this. We are live streaming this event. We're going to do about an hour and 10 minutes with our panelists. Mika will be moderating the event, and we'll try to open it up to the audience as much as possible. We are expecting several hundred, if not more, people watching this online. So when we get to the question and answer period or comment period, I would really appreciate it if people would turn themselves as much as they can to the cameras so we don't get the back of your head. And I'll play a little bit of an Oprah role at that point, running around making sure that we have the microphone in your hand when you're addressing the audience and the panelists. And without further ado, none of this would be possible without the hard work, dedication, and incredible intellect of my partner, Mika Sifry, who I'm about to turn the floor over to. So Mika, go for it.
Thank you. Is this on? Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for coming this evening. I recognize some faces who were here a year ago when we did our flash conference on WikiLeaks, and it has been quite a year since then, and we thought we would do this event tonight partly because it has been such an interesting period, and we thought it would be good to sort of both try and put a capstone on understanding the way that democracy is changing as movements like the Tea Party and now Occupy Wall Street are disrupting and opening up the political conversation. And we also thought we would take advantage of the fact that we were launching a completely new brand, Personal Democracy Media, and our own completely redesigned websites, which perhaps we can show a screenshot of. But go check them out. Kick the tires. They're still in beta, personaldemocracy.com and techpresident.com. And give us your feedback. But the idea is we wanted to make it easier for people to use the information on these sites, easier to comment, easier to find some of the rich material that are in our archives, and easier to also tap into the conversation through live calls, and mini events like this, and obviously our upcoming conference next June 11th and 12th, which will be right here at NYU in this building. In a second, I'm going to introduce our panel, but let me just say I want to thank the Engage Network along with NYU ITP for partnering with us on this event to make it possible, and our co-sponsors, the Movement Strategy Center, the McKay Foundation, and Greenpeace's Digital Mobilization Lab, and our media co-sponsor, the Sidney Hillman Foundation. So we're going to do this like we did our earlier flash conference on WikiLeaks, which is to say this is a big panel, but we're going to move through this panel quite quickly. Everybody's been told that they're going to get 8 minutes for a opening statement, remarks, provocation, and I'm going to be watching the clock like a hawk to make sure that people really do keep to that time so that we have plenty of time to get to you. We are also going to be tracking the conversation on Twitter. If people want to tweet about it, the hashtag is PDM TEAOWS, PDM TEAOWS. Clay joked with me that we need a hashtag for this hashtag. He's probably right, but it's too late. PDM TEAOWS is the hashtag. And we're going to move across the table in the order of where people are sitting, and I should just mention before we dive in that two of our panelists at the moment are not with us. Unfortunately, Jenny Beth Martin at the last minute had a bit of a personal health situation, and she unfortunately had to pull out. And Alexis McGill Johnson called me this afternoon with something similar. It may be that she will show up, and we will, of course, welcome her to the stage, but also in her case, illness may be keeping her from joining us. So luckily, we have plenty of panelists, and I'm sure we will not have a problem keeping the evening alive and provocative. Last thing I want to say before we dive in with our first speaker is this is unusual, I know, because we have people here who the other 365 days of the year could conceivably be at their throats. It's not a typical event to have representatives of the Tea Party and the Occupy movement sharing microphones with each other. And I want to thank them for doing so, and I want to remind everybody here, our speakers as well as the folks in the room and the people watching, that the topic of tonight is the future of networked democracy, the way that interactive communications, networked collaboration is changing how our system works and perhaps making it better. We shall see. It is not, we are not here to debate whether the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street is right or wrong in their political aims. Okay? We're going to suspend our disagreements that we may have on that, save them for another day, save them for the hallways. We can do that the other 364 days of the year. But this is part of PDF's mission, is to try and create a space where we can bridge some of these seemingly intractable differences that I suspect divide us more than they should, and instead create a space where we can actually look at what maybe we have in common, or at least share notes on this amazing time that we're living through and helping to create. So, without further ado, I'm going to start with very brief introductions of each speaker, and then hand the mic off to them, and then we'll work our way through. So we're going to start with Ori Brafman, and it's a privilege to have Ori with us. He's got a great career in both entrepreneurship, in the business and government and nonprofit sectors, but he's here especially because his first book, which he co-authored, called The Starfish and the Spider, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations, which came out 5 years ago and is now in its 16th printing, and is a little bit of a Bible for people in both the Tea Party and Occupy worlds. So we couldn't think of a better person to open this conference with. Ori.
Thank you so much. And I should say that my comments today are largely developed with my collaboration with Judah Pollock, who I'm working on my next book with. Do you guys know the song from Sesame Street, One Thing Is Not Like the Other, right? There's like a spoon and there's like a fork. I'm kind of like the fork in the story. So I'm sitting there a couple of years ago on this Northern California lawn, and there's a DJ playing electronic music. I'm wearing very little, and that very little is pink fur. And I'm having a conversation about vibe, and that's not that weird of a story for me because I live in San Francisco. I went to UC Berkeley. I was a peace and conflict studies major. I'm a vegan. What's interesting about the story is that that same day I go home, I clean up, I put away my fur outfit, and I get on a plane and I go to Virginia. And I have a meeting with this man named Martin Dempsey, who at the time was at the Army. And I knew nothing about the Army at the time. I've been a lifelong civilian, member of UC Berkeley Peace Conflict Studies. And I'm sitting there in this office with him, and this is before he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he asked me about my work around starfish and spider, and specifically the metaphor being that if you take a spider and you cut off the head, it dies. And if you cut off the arm of a starfish, it actually grows the arm right back. Not only that, but in a lot of species, the arm grows an entirely new creature. And the reason for that is because the spider has a tiny little brain, has a tiny little head, and the starfish doesn't. Each one of the arms basically functions independently, and therefore the creature can grow its limbs back. So we're talking about the application of starfish to our fight against various starfish organizations like Al-Qaeda. And he asked me, what do you think we can do to become more adaptable? And I think about it, and at the same moment I also noticed in front of me there's a box. And I said, what's inside the box, Marty? I didn't know I was supposed to call him General. And he opens the box, and inside are baseball card items in there, and instead of pictures of baseball players, they're pictures of soldiers. And he opens the box, and he takes card after card and lays them on the table. And each card represents a soldier who died under his command. And he says, I carry this box wherever I go, and I call the members, the family members, as many times as I can. And I realized that this guy was trying to figure out how can we become adaptable, not just for an intellectual exercise, but in order to protect lives, in order to protect these soldiers' lives. And I look at him, and my mother never taught me manners, and I say, I don't know how to make the Army more adaptable, but neither do you, because you're so far removed from the edge of the network because of the stars on your uniform. And I think about it overnight. I'm saying, well, you know what? There might be something here. And we come up with this kind of crazy idea, and we say, what if we start small circles here in the Army? And we start circles of 12 to 16 people each, with no agenda, with no end state, without a strategy, with no leadership, just the idea of getting people to talk with one another. We do it out of uniform in places off base. And all my friends thought I was completely nuts. They're like, don't you know the Army has so many years of history of being top down, and these people will never open up to you, and it's going to get so political. And still we sit down with these 12 individuals, and we just have conversations. And a lot of these conversations are emotionally based conversations about people sharing stories from their lives. The third day of the circle, one of the guys, he's a soldier, and he's in his early 30s, and he says, you know what, last night was the first night that I slept all night in 3 years. And he shares this story of being in Iraq and how his best friend and him and other soldiers had to clear a room. And his best friend got shot in the head right in front of him. And he had to see that, and not only seeing that, he had to take command of the group that he was with. And that's haunted him. And for some reason, being in a small circle liberated him a little bit. And why did I tell you this story? It's because we can scream ourselves blue and red in the face talking about politics. But the really interesting thing that's going on with Occupy and with Tea Party isn't the what, isn't the ultimate message that they're trying to convey. It's the how. And there's 5 lessons that we can learn from this. The first lesson is that of emergence. Whenever you take people in a circle, whenever you have a non-hierarchical system, you don't know what's going to emerge. Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, could never have imagined that he will build an international network. You don't know what's going to emerge from these circles either, whether it's Tea Party or whether it's the Occupy movement. The second element is this idea of asking the right questions. And I would say that when it comes to circles, you have 2 types of people. You have people that are either inside the circle or outside the circle. The people outside the circle are going to be asking very intelligent, the wrong questions. They're going to ask who's in charge. They're going to ask how much money do you have. They're going to ask what's your strategy. They're going to ask what's going to happen next month. Those questions are irrelevant when it comes to our starfish organization. there are only two questions that are relevant. The first and most important question is, how much trust do you have with one another? How much emotional bonding is there? The second question is, how much do you believe in your cause? And if you believe in your cause and there's trust, then the emergence will take over, and all of a sudden you will have a movement that you couldn't have predicted. The fourth element is we're seeing, especially in Occupy, and I think we're seeing this in Tea Party as well. You have an entire generation that's used to communicating via tweets, having events that are loosely organized, blogging, tweeting. For years and years and years, this generation has been playing around with these technologies. And all of a sudden, we're seeing a generation operationalizing its play. You look at the General Assembly, for example. And the way that people communicate with the human microphone, you have to communicate in tweet-sized messages. This is a different way of organizing. The fifth thing to consider, I think, is the most important. Anybody who's going to guess what's going to happen next in the Tea Party or what's going to happen next in Occupy, I inherently distrust because they don't get the idea of emergence. This is going to be a platform for activism moving forward. And I want to tell you the very quick story of this woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton who goes to Britain, and she goes to an anti-slavery conference. And at this anti-slavery conference, she comes up with the idea that women need to have the right to vote in America. She comes back to America and founds the women's suffrage movement. Could anyone have predicted that a little meeting in London would have started the women's suffrage movement? No. And that's what we need to focus on. Isn't necessarily what's going to happen tomorrow, but what more activism is this going to lead to tomorrow? And finally, again, it's the idea not of what these people are fighting for. We might have very different visions of how America should be, but what's important is how are we going to fight for it? And that is going to be based on the small circles of trust.
Thank you for that opening. Our next speaker, Marianne Manilov, comes to us from the Engage Network, where she's been a grassroots organizer and network weaver for many years. I should mention that Marianne is partly responsible for instigating this event, or at least helping us grow it into something a little bit larger than what we had originally thought we might do. I appreciate that. And Marianne's also been involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement building working group here in New York. Marianne, go ahead.
Thanks, Mika. And I just want to say it's such an honor, really, to be on this panel with Clay Shirky, who I learned so much about network building from, and from you, who have a history about writing about movements, Mika, and Ori, who taught me so much, and also everyone else who's here. So I first came to the Occupy Wall Street Park, Zuccotti Park, after I had been doing some movement building in North Carolina. The Engage Network incubates and also builds networks with organizations. So we do that kind of work on the ground with a number of people. So if people have 1 million people on an email list and they want to do something beyond the email list and actually work on the ground, that's what we come in and help to build, these pathways and small circle networks. So I had been in North Carolina really for a good period of time, and there I was meeting veterans who had 60, 70% unemployment, communities really on the front lines of the economic disaster. It's something New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman calls a man-made disaster. In North Carolina, I met a woman named Sherbia Jones, and she mostly wears gold all of the time. She's known for her line dancing, and she's a grandmother. And what's amazing about Sherbia is that she is using her retirement money to keep her community afloat. She's literally taking kids and buying them school supplies and groceries, and she's really one of the economic sort of legs that's left in her community. And Sherbia is also a movement builder. She's come to movement building trainings, and she's part of a network of people in North Carolina who are helping each other out, who are standing together. When I interviewed these community members over and over and over again, they said one thing: we have to take care of each other because no one is coming for us. We are all that we have left to survive. No one's coming for us. So when I first visited Occupy Wall Street on that first day in Zuccotti Park, I met a woman named Amy Hamburger, who's here tonight. And she's part of the Occupy Wall Street kitchen. So Amy told me on that first day, she was like, this is, to me, is all about how we're taking care of each other, how we're about community. And Amy told me this story. And what she told me about is that one night she was in the medical area of Occupy, and there was not a lot of other medics there. Was only one person there. And a man who was homeless came by. He had been cutting himself. He said, this is what I do when I get sad. This is how I release tension. So the medic started bandaging this man up, and Amy started rubbing his feet. But some of the newer people who had come to Occupy, because of course Occupy has a lot of people at that time coming into the park, really felt that this man was a danger in some way. They were afraid of him, and so they got the new people from Occupy Security, and they got the police, and they sort of said to the man, why don't you come out of the park? And they took him to a mental hospital. And he managed to work his way back to the park, but Amy was deeply upset by this because she said to me, this man needed community care. He didn't need institutionalization. He needed us. This is what we are about. And I think that this is something, when I saw it, I remember sitting down on a park bench and just after I heard that story from Amy and crying, and I thought, wow, this is what transformation really looks like. This is why this is a transformational movement. Just like the black church was in the Deep South, people taking care of each other, really knowing birth, death, every moment of each other's life. And Occupy is transformative in that it aims at a time when so many are being left out and left behind to leave no one behind. And as utopian and imperfect as that has been, and the idea and practice of it in the parks, it's a key part of this network-led democracy movement. So the network-led democracy movement, in my mind, has three important traits. The first is what I've just shared. It's a transformational process. It's where the community becomes an example of what is possible. Communities and movements are becoming networks of care. In a society where every single transaction is monetized, where you can buy and sell anything, these new networks are building the pathway of where we need to go, of what it looks like. The second is that these new network-led democracy movements start at a community level. Like Twitter, network democracy starts with an individual and spreads across the network, nationalizing as different hubs take on the same issue. Building a national effort from communities joining together rather than an organization launching a national campaign. And the third is that they are starfish. They can't be shut down. They replicate and spread when faced with extinction. In network democracy, the Occupy Wall Street movement, with just a couple hundred people left, really facing the cold of winter, were taken out of the park. And several days later, 30,000 people marched across the Brooklyn Bridge. In the same way, in Oakland, we had a situation where there was a military person who was shot and put in the hospital, and there were tear gassed of people who were young people and just incredible police brutality. And within a short period of time, the Oakland port was shut down. Anytime you try and squelch these kinds of efforts through communication, through Twitter, through Facebook, through everyone talking, they multiply. So one more story. Catherine Lennon is a grandmother that I met in Rochester, New York. On March 28th of this year, 2011, she was evicted from the home that she had lived in with her husband. And it was a home that had seen family holidays. She actually poured the concrete on the front steps. She was the first homeowner in her family. Her husband died in that home in 2008. And when he died, the bank refused to renegotiate with her. Kathy's story isn't really remarkable in some ways. 3 million people, 8,000 of them today, are going to face that knock on the door. But it was history-making because she refused to go quietly. She actually stood outside with, in the face of 15 police cars with her neighbors. One of them was still in their pajamas and said, no, we won't go, and they were all arrested. And she joined with a group, that's a starfish group, called Take Back the Land, of little groups around the country who are helping people do this kind of eviction defense. And they managed to put her back in her home, which is where she still is. And Bank of America, which received a $90 billion bailout, and Stephen J. Baum Law Firm, which is a robo-signing group that's under investigation, came up against this grandmother. And as it turns out, last week, they had to back down. They asked for an indefinite suspension in her case because they cannot prove that they had the right to foreclose in the first place. Kathy, to me, is the Rosa Parks of the foreclosure movement. Her case asks, what happens when someone is evicted when the ownership of the house is in legal limbo? And this is something that's faced by people all over this country. The bank has said it will never give her her home because it would set a precedent, and she's continuing her fight. But Kathy Lennon's story is a great example of this movement because it's not just about her home. Kathy was one person in Rochester, but in Ohio and Atlanta, people who were being foreclosed on came to the Occupy encampments and said to them, please come and be with us, come and help us stay in our homes. And Occupy people had gone and literally set up tents on people's homes. So as that began to build from the ground up, the Occupy movement began to see it. And on December 6th, they launched a national effort called Occupy Our Homes, where people in 19 cities moved from the parks to people's neighborhoods and decided to stand up with those who were most impacted. And Becca, who's on this panel tonight, I know she didn't sleep for like 4 days planning that. But the reality is that it's a great example of this new network-led democracy. Because when groups join together and really start to see each other and reflect, then that's true movement. It's not a campaign going outward, it's something coming up, and it can be felt. Network-led democracy is about this grandmother in Ohio who's using her retirement savings, and it's about the prayer and faith of that network who sits on a porch and literally prays together for what to do next. It's about the moms group in West Oakland that held story time in one of these foreclosed homes. And it's about the communities around the country who are building alternative currency. Network democracy is these small groups of people who are coming together and they're re-knitting the fabric of our abandoned communities by standing together. In a time of economic collapse, when no one is coming for us, network-led democracy is transformational. It's a transformational movement because it means we're coming for each other.
Okay, you'll begin to see the weave in these different threads, but I don't want to give it all away. Our next speaker, Jessica Shearer, has been working inside the Occupy movement as a faith and labor organizer. She comes from a more traditional background in the labor movement, and most recently directing the SEIU's healthcare education project here in New York. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about the Occupy movement and labor in particular, and the sort of the way these two different kinds of institutions are interacting and bumping into each other and maybe affecting each other.
Okay, quick question, because some of these things I've never said in public before, so I'm a little curious about who's in the room. How many people here are Occupy people, including supporters in any way? Any labor people in the room? I know a few. Tea Party folks?
Oh, it's lonely in here.
And personal democracy media folks? All right, thanks. I've worked for the labor movement for 14 years. I love unions. We're huge multiracial membership organizations. We grow the middle class. We brought the world the weekend. Still, everywhere, unions stagnate. We shrink. Unions fall victim to our own scale and sophistication. We know that Occupy is important, but we're still learning its lessons. We're now in a movement moment. Finally, my first. This could be a period of tremendous growth. The time is therefore ripe for a little self-criticism. I'll start with a story I know best, my own. In '91, the townhouse I shared with my mom and two little sisters went into foreclosure. She called the bank, and then she called her union. No response. To keep us housed, she married hastily. Our bills got paid, but we weren't safe. 2 years in, we gathered everything we could carry in garbage bags, and we fled. We'd always had a tenuous but middle-class existence. My stepfather's brutality left us terrified and homeless. My mom called her union again. No response. Not a single word. Not ever. In desperation, she turned to the evangelical church. By nightfall, we had a place to stay and a turkey stew. Within a month, an affordable rental and the furniture to fill it. The union wouldn't have had to guarantee us a home. A call back would have helped. A casserole might have won my mom over for life. 17 years later, my mom and both my sisters are active in the evangelical church. They vote Republican. They hate unions. In the years since, labor has gotten smarter. We've gotten more strategic, but there are even few casseroles these days. Lacking the personal touch impacts not only loyalty, but also mobilization. 2010, let's juxtapose two rallies. One, Restoring Honor, headlined by Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin. The other, One Nation, organized by the NAACP and SEIU. Truth? The Tea Party rally kicked our butt. In marching in King's footsteps, we did not suffer from a lack of moral authority. SEIU is hands down the largest civil rights organization in the country. Our problem, radically oversimplified, was buses. My union paid for enough buses to send 50,000 people to the rally for free, but we couldn't fill them. For turnout, we used our large professional call center and mass mailings. We had the infrastructure, but they, you, had something visceral, intangible, and priceless. Momentum, a meaningful sense of ownership. We missed that. Flash forward 368 days, October 5th. Unions are racing to catch up with the fierce and nimble kids in the park. Labor's endorsement confers a legitimacy. Occupy's numbers swell to 12,000 that day. For the first time in a labor march, almost every single sign is handmade. By November 17th, tents are out, but the unions are all in. The crowd grows to 33,000. Worlds collide a little. Mary Kay Henry, president of SEIU, starts the day by endorsing Obama, a year before the election. She ends that day putting her body on the line and getting arrested for Occupy. Occupy has charted a course outside the electoral system. And where has that gotten them? Electeds are flocking. Many have suddenly noticed a decades-long crisis in income inequality. Our own Governor 1% reversed himself on taxing the wealthy. That's a $2 billion win. Not bad for a movement with no demands. The rapid response follow the anger quality of labor's jump into Occupy is to be celebrated. But neither October 5th nor N17 could boast a whole lot of union members. Union leaders rolled deep, union staff out in force, but in New York, 1 in 4 working people are union members. That's millions. We haven't gotten there yet. To say labor is at a crossroads is a gross understatement. Labor is on the edge of a cliff. What we lack, what we feel we can no longer afford, is human-scale outreach. Decades of defeat have reined in our imagination. We once aspired to be the left wing of the possible. These days, we're barely even the left wing of the Democratic Party. In 2008, we learned something about storytelling, but the story we told over and over was Obama's. We need to tell our own stories. Our stories are powerful, and every member has one. I'm not advocating a naive passivity or an abandonment of corporate campaigns, but a radical listening, an interest in our membership that transcends our mobilizations and can thus inform them. Occupy Wall Street can teach us much. I'm not sure Occupy Congress is it. There are hundreds in Congress who could do way better by us, and they're by no means limited to just one side of the aisle. Down at Zuccotti, there are dozens of spiral notebooks full of the names of union members who want to get involved. The rank and file subcommittee of the Labor Working Group has 4 or 5 subcommittees of its own. They're meeting nonstop, and they're having so much fun. Witness the fight outside Sotheby's, where the Teamsters have been locked out for months. Since Occupy started, the stately block on the Upper East Side echoes with mayhem. Tactics evolve from hour to hour. Workers and occupiers huddle on the corner to decide what's next. Will they riot? Will they dance? Sotheby's is totally unnerved. Most unions don't know what to do with this kind of self-organization. People want to be asked to do more. Maybe they don't want to rally in DC or sit in the Sheraton getting a pep talk before each election. We don't know. We don't ask. Maybe what they want is to deliver a casserole to the family down the street with fear in their eyes, or start a softball league. We should want that too. It's not an alternative to real organizing. It is real organizing. What's held unions back? A lie. Right-to-work laws, corporations that may be too big to organize, an emboldened right, and a fear of risking our power, alienating our friends. So what can Occupy do for the labor movement? Everything. We can learn to listen to each other, feed each other, think bigger. The math is against us, but if we've learned anything from Zuccotti, it's that there's more than just numbers. We are hopeful, and we are pissed off. Our best hope? The 30,000 fired Bank of America workers see themselves in the eyes of the locked out Teamsters. With wind at our back and a labor movement that's truly 15 million workers strong, our most daunting organizing challenges become winnable. If what began as a trickle down at Zuccotti can become a tsunami that reaches deep into the workplace, we can tackle Bank of America one day and Walmart the next. It will not be simple, but the visionaries at Occupy are right. This is the beginning of the beginning, or it can be.
Okay, so our next speaker, Mark Meckler, comes to us from the Tea Party Patriots, which he helps run. We had his co-coordinator of Tea Party Patriots, Jenny Beth Martin, here at PDF last June, and I'm sad to say she was not able to also join us tonight. I will give Mark a little extra time if he feels he needs it. It's a privilege to have you, Mark.
Thank you very much. And it feels so friendly in here to be the sole Tea Partier. I appreciate that. I'd like to start with a story of something that happened to me fairly recently. And it relates to the fact that I'm the only quote-unquote self-identified Tea Partier here in the room. Over about the past year or so, I've had the privilege to work with Professor Lawrence Lessig. Some of you might know him. He's a professor at Harvard Law School. And you couldn't find two guys that are more ideologically opposed. Really, I mean, we could probably argue about virtually any policy decision now facing the country. But over the last year, we've had a series of conversations and emails and meetings where we've realized that there is a fundamental overlap between our beliefs. The overlap really has nothing to do with politics. The overlap has to do with the survival of the republic. Both of us believe fundamentally at our core, in a passionate and frankly fearful way, that the republic is at risk. The lunatics are running the asylum. We're not in charge anymore. And that's not how this country was designed. This country was designed with an incredible faith in the citizenry, in our power as individuals, as networks of individuals, to control the beast that the founders knew would be the government. They weren't foolish people. They understood. They had a grasp of history that eludes, frankly, most of us in the modern world. They read from the same compendium of both literature and history. They knew government history all the way back to the Israelites. They understood the nature of man, I think, better than most of us do. And they knew that we were in for a heap of trouble over the years. But they placed their faith and they built a system around the idea that if citizens paid attention, that if we stayed in control, that we could control this beast that they knew government was destined to attempt to become. This is something that Larry and I fundamentally agree on. And we agree that we as citizens are responsible for the current state of the nation. You'll hear folks in the Tea Party, you'll hear folks in Occupy movement, and every movement across the spectrum and every organization across the spectrum blame the politicians. We'll talk about the corruption in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about the crazy state of my state back in California. We talk about those things as if we're disconnected from them, as if those politicians are not from us and of us, as if we didn't vote for them and put them in office. We talk about it as if it's not our responsibility. But it is. The government that's in Washington, the government that's in Albany, the government that's in Sacramento, California, are our elected officials. They are our fellow citizens, and we are responsible for all the troubles that befall our nation. Whether we believe those troubles are caused by corporatism, by undue corporate influence in government, as I do, I think it also extends to big union involvement in government. We're responsible for those things. We've tolerated those things. We have, for many years, frankly, since the beginning of the nation, allowed the nation to slip out of our hands. This incredible experiment in liberty, and it is an experiment, and it is unusual. This is not the standard in human history. This kind of prosperity, this kind of liberty, this kind of freedom, it is irregular. It is unusual if you read the course of history. It is unique, and it is something special that we should fight for. And at its root is network democracy. And we're here to talk about the future of network democracy, but I think we should talk about the history first. Because you can go all the way back to the founding of this nation, and it is, at its root, network democracy. Living under tyranny, the citizens of the colonies found a way to network themselves. They didn't have Twitter or cell phones or even the telegraph, but they found a way to network. People who shared the same beliefs and the same ideals and the same dreams for their family found a way, despite the obstacles, to come together, and sometimes those obstacles were extreme. Today we talk about the difficulties of the occupiers out in the cold in the park, or the Tea Partiers, lots of whom have given up their houses. They've lost their houses because they're so involved in the movement. They've let go of everything else. We talk about those difficulties as if they're true hardships. But if we think back to our history, if we think back to what those men and women, I call them the founding families, those families were willing to put on the line for the idea of liberty, that they were willing to build networks, they were willing to sign their names to documents, they were willing to participate in committees of correspondence, which ultimately resulted in treason. Treason. Not a cold night in the park, not some family hardship, not like me. Sometimes I feel bad for myself because I'm away from my kids and my wife all the time. That's not hardship. It's maybe the sacrifice of a little bit of privilege, but the reality is these original network citizens, the originators of the network democracy, were willing to put it all on the line, every bit of it, everything they had. Their lives, literally. Their fortunes, absolutely, and many of them ended up destitute, and their sacred honor. That passionate commitment you talked about to each other. They were willing to commit to each other that they were there no matter what. In their case, it really did mean no matter what, right? The committees of correspondence. Men who got together against the odds, against the king. They had a king. Against the king's army. And who fomented. Who made common cause together. Again, no internet, no phones. Written correspondence who made sure that the word got out about whatever the common cause was. That's the model. That's what we're doing today. I think it's important to remember, both in humility and pride, that all of us, everybody at this table, everybody in this room, everybody in any of these movements, or any citizen that's willing to fight for their country, what they believe their country should be, stands in those great footsteps. So it started with the committees of correspondence, and the Tea Party started in much the same way. On February 19th, 2009, Rick Santelli, a financial reporter on CNBC, was asked a question about mortgage bailouts by the government, bailouts in general. And he did what is now famously referred to as the Santelli rant. He's something of a saint in the Tea Party movement. And he's a guy who never profited, who's never actually been involved in the movement, but I think was quite astounded at what happened. And he said, it's anti-American what's happening. We're rewarding people for bad behavior. And we're punishing those who have done the right thing, who have made the right decisions in their lives. We're going to make them pay for the bad behavior of others. And it ignited a movement, unintentionally, organically, passionately. The clip of the Rick Santelli rant made its way across the internet like wildfire. It's kind of like throwing a match in a puddle of gasoline. Nobody planned it. He didn't plan it. Nobody set this thing up. It just exploded. And a lot of people, myself included, saw that clip on the internet. And when I saw it, I worked from home around my wife and kids. I saw what he was saying, and I pounded my fist on my desk, and I said, yeah, that's it. I believe what he said. It was a clarifying moment for me. And he called for a tea party. None of us knew what a tea party was. I mean, we probably had a little bit of high school history about the Boston Tea Party, maybe some grammar school history. That's all we knew. And he actually called for one on July 4th, 2009. And then the social networks took over. There were a group of people who were networked on Twitter using the hashtag TCOT for Top Conservatives on Twitter. And one of those people, Michael Patrick Leahy, put out a call on Twitter, and he said, let's have a conference call to discuss this. Put out a number. 22 people showed up on the next day. Again, totally organic, spontaneous. There was no organization. There was no website. There were no call lists. 22 people showed up. Jenny Beth Martin, my co-founder, was among them. And they talked about, what do you do when a movement seems to have started organically? What can we do to help? What can we do to take advantage of it? And they decided to hold a tea party, or tea parties, a week later. Not July 4th, but strike while the iron is hot. I think you're seeing some of this in the Occupy movement. You have to move. You can't wait. In a network democracy, today with technology, everything moves literally at the speed of light. So they planned to have a tea party the next week, which is 7 days later, literally February 27th, and they put it out on Facebook, and folks started putting up Facebook pages for individual tea parties around the country, and they hoped originally to have 5 to 10 of them around the country. So I found out about it on Facebook. I'm a dutiful husband, so I asked my wife's permission first before I jumped in. And she, being from Boston, thought a tea party was a pretty good idea. So I'm a country boy. We live up in Grass Valley, a little town up in Northern California. And I asked my parents if they wanted to come along. And they're retired. They said yes. I took my kids out of school. At the time, they were 13 and 9. And I wanted to show them what the First Amendment looked like. Now, remember, we're what you might call conservatives. I know that could be a bad word here. And we're not used to protesting. I'd never been to a protest in my life. And we decided to do this as a family. 6 of us driving down the hill in my F-350 pickup with our signs in the back, and we're going to protest. And we show up at the state capitol, and the very first thing that happens is the police show up. You need a permit to protest. We didn't know this. We had no experience. Luckily, they were nice, and we were able to continue. We filled out the paperwork, and that day, 150 people showed up at that protest in Sacramento. And I talked to every one of them because I couldn't believe they were there. There were other people out there who felt like I did. And I was stunned by who was there more than anything. And it was everybody. It was every race. It was people from every societal class. There were teachers. There were employers. There were unemployed. There were union members. In California, Proposition 8 was a big deal at the time, the Marriage and Family Act. There were folks that were gay rights activists. There were folks that were pro-marriage and family. There were pro-life. There were pro-choice. Every one of them carrying a sign that said something similar, something about, I want to get government off my back. I've had enough. I can make my own decisions. Whether it was out of my bedroom, out of my business, out of my school, I just want government to leave me alone to lead my life. And to me, that was an epiphany. It was this spontaneous network of people who shared the same passion. And the root of that passion was liberty for all of those people. And Ori talked about feeling and the feelings that are necessary to have a movement. I don't know anything about building a movement. To be honest with you, I am so outclassed sitting on this stage. I'm just a dad and a country guy and a husband and an American. I'm not a professional movement builder. I haven't read a lot about building movements. I haven't been involved in any other movements. Never done this before in my life, never intended to do it. But I know as I listen to some of these other people speak that they speak the truth. They've learned it through years of hard experience. I learned it the lucky way. I stumbled into this thing. There were actually 49 Tea Parties around the country on that first day. Over 35,000 people came out and participated. No money, no budget, no website, no Koch brothers. I'm still waiting for the check if any of you know how to get it to me. I'm open to almost anything. So we came home and we were excited. We couldn't believe 150 people showed up. We couldn't believe that these things took place all over the country. And I did what I normally do. It's just my nature. I networked. I started looking at Facebook pages and calling people first around California to say, what did you do? Did it work? What didn't work? What was best? What was worse? And I just wrote all this stuff down. And pretty soon people started calling me. They said, there's this guy, Meckler, up in Northern California, and he knows the person in San Francisco if you want to know what they did. Suddenly, I was the de facto California coordinator. I wasn't appointed by anybody. You know, it's just I was the guy calling around, seeing what people were doing. If you've read Starfish and the Spider, and if you haven't, you have to. This is how it happens. It wasn't really leadership. I was just willing to step up and ask some questions and raise my hand and find out. Ultimately, that led me across the country, and I realized there were people who had done this all over the country. That's how I met Jenny Beth Martin out of Atlanta. She'd done the same thing in Atlanta. Pretty soon there were a core group of people saying, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And I saw it because of my background as a technology lawyer as open source. This was exactly like the development of open source software. I mean, it was a visual to me. That first line of code had been written, and it was, a Tea Party is a public protest against a government run amok. It was nothing more than that. And people began contributing to that code. In Atlanta, they said, well, if you have 500 people show up like they did, you need a sound system and a little stage. Otherwise, nobody could hear or see what was being said and done. In Sacramento, we learned if you're on the state capitol grounds, you need a permit. And this kind of knowledge began being added to the code base totally organically. Nobody led it. Nobody was telling anybody to do it. There was no website still. There was nothing but people who were acting from their passion and creating, as Ori said, circles, totally organic circles. Communities of people coming together in Sacramento, in Atlanta, in New York, in Boston, and they began overlapping. They began communicating with each other, like the committees of correspondence. And that caused the movement to grow organically. Again, nobody driving it. A few of us said, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? We thought, April 15th. People are pissed off on April 15th already. We should take advantage of that momentum, right? That's natural momentum. A day when people are generally frustrated with their government. And we planned the next round of Tea Party protests. Our first website, our first real use of technology consciously. We had taxdayteaparty.com. And there were 5 of us really in the core group who were taking calls and fielding emails and manually listing things on this WordPress website. We had no real technology, and the thing started to crash because 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people pounding on the thing. We were unprepared. And then it started to get media play, and it became out of control. And we started to get calls from media people who wanted to come to the events. And pretty soon there were 60, 70, 90 events listed for this April 15th event. And we thought, wow, if we could do 100, I mean, we did 49 the first time. If we could have 100 events, it would be extraordinary. And 2 days before April 15th, on April 13th, we had to close down registrations. We could no longer handle it. And at that point, there were 850 Tea Parties listed around the United States of America. That makes it literally the largest single-day, multi-city, simultaneous protest in history. And ultimately, by our best count, and we called literally manually every organizer of every Tea Party and tried to confirm it in every way we could. It took us about 6 weeks. There were about 1.2 million people that came out that day. Natural, organic, network democracy. Our budget for that event on April 15, 2009, 0. Our paid staff on that day, none. Our organizational structure, we didn't have one. And we were able to create 850 Tea Parties. I say we were able to create it. It wasn't me. It wasn't Jenny Beth. It wasn't any individual organizer. I know the book is titled Leaderless Organizations, or subtitled, but this was organically developing as a leaderfull organization. There were literally at least 850 leaders organically sprouting up around the country, and the truth is there were thousands. And we decided to continue to play on this structure. That's when we formed Tea Party Patriots. We knew there needed to be a go-forward organization to help lift this movement up, to provide it a conduit. And ever since then, every Monday night, since February of 2009, we have our national leadership conference call. Every local coordinator participates, and they tell the organization what to do. It truly is a bottom-up organization. By the way, I'm missing it for you guys tonight, so I appreciate you hosting me here tonight.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. We'll I'm sure in the Q&A we'll get to, hopefully we'll get to hear you tell us where it's going now, but that was a great way to lay the foundation. Our next speaker, Becca Economopoulos, is a, she is a organizer with Occupy Wall Street and a senior strategist with Fish and Strategy and a old friend of PDF, I should add, spoken before at one of our conferences. I can't remember which one. You don't either. And Becca has been deeply involved in a lot of the work that's happened here in New York since Occupy began. And so I'm very much thrilled that she's here joining us. Is it true you haven't had dinner, a normal evening dinner in 3 months? Almost.
Perhaps, yes.
So she's been very, very hard at work, and it's a privilege to have her here to describe what's been going on. Becca.
Great. Thanks, Micha. What I wanted to do is jump on the bandwagon a little bit and talk about the merits of network-focused organizing versus more traditional advocacy models or politics as usual that focus exclusively on organizations or coalitions, and deconstruct a little bit what I think makes Occupy and the Tea Party successful. But I'd also like to weave in a few cautionary notes around the evangelism of leaderless or exclusively kind of process-focused or tools-focused organizing, and plus an evangelism of form and means at the expense of ends. So I'll just start with talking about network organizing. Now, I have a background as a professional organizer, working for years with organizations, but also having some movement organizing experience. I was involved in what I call the alter globalization movement. Anti-globalization was really a misnomer. And something that I think is very different, that organizations are very well equipped to activate their constituencies, right? And usually, more often than not, that's around single issue politics or a platform, a range of issues. Whereas I think movement organizing that is effective or successful in taking off is often more systemically focused rather than issue focused, in that it also really speaks to network theory insofar as it's about activating nodes of influence. And that is a very, very different model than blasting your email list to turn folks out, or making calls, your conference call with coalition so that you can collectively turn out numbers for a particular day, and that's it. What that doesn't set you up for is this self-propelled organizing that happens on the part of unaffiliated individuals. So people who feel deeply motivated and empowered to be able to form their own networks, right? And that also nodes of influence are activating, their own constituencies. Those are their spheres of influence, their friends, their colleagues, people who are aligned around particular affinities and interests. So to me, that's what network-focused organizing looks like. And, good old-fashioned organizing principles tell us that that would be more effective. What you were speaking to, which is like the difference, I think, between community organizing and just advocacy-focused organizing, where it's more deeply entrenched in community, in lived experience. And also, we know this not just from organizing principles, but from lessons from the advertising and persuasion industries. And that is that it's not the case that one size fits all, one message fits all. Madison Avenue will tell you, you have a target audience and you develop a vocabulary around that particular audience. They have different goals and interests from another one, right? That's the same thing you learn as a canvasser knocking on doors, right? Is that it's not one wrap fits all, right? That ultimately when you show up, it's human to human, person to person, talking about, hey, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? What upsets you? What motivates you? And how does that connect to the reason why I'm at the door? So I think that's a really important thing as we're thinking about building movements, is to recognize that people are motivated by self-interest, not altruism, right? Altruism is the organization model, where I would argue it's a very kind of liberal model of we'll help you. Versus if you're framing things in a more systemic way, then it's understanding how your self-interest is connected to someone else's, and you're building much deeper alliances. It's coming from kind of a deeper place. That also, I think back to the 2006 immigrant rights movement, when there were they caught fire across the country, started off in Los Angeles, about 1 million people turned out. The media and my colleagues within the online organizing and technology fields were really excited about the role that MySpace was playing in turning folks out. And I think that's valid and valuable, but I really see it as a blended model, right? So one, it's laying the groundwork and the foundation for people to be networked through social networks, so that when there are these catalytic moments, you can fan the flames and it takes off organically. However, what organizations do bring to the picture is resources, infrastructure, and scale. So I think it would be remiss to walk away from this panel and not think that organizations and infrastructure actually play a very significant role, that is a hybrid model of bottom-up and top-down, and that we think about it, at least in Occupy Wall Street and other movements, I would suggest, as alliances or solidarity rather than coalitions. And that's also really, really important from the perspective or vantage of Occupy Wall Street, right? And I'm sure the Tea Party hears this, and Occupy Wall Street hears this. On our end, it's Soros, the labor unions, et cetera. That's who's running the show. I would argue that that's absolutely not the case. However, there are times where our interests converge, and that's when we're going to do joint turnout. Or, for instance, when there was the threat of eviction because Bloomberg and the city wanted to clean Zuccotti Park, and many of us read that as we want to dismantle the encampment permanently. That was a time where folks kicked into gear, did a lot of local organizing in Zuccotti and leveraging our various online properties in order to activate our networks, but also putting in phone calls to friends within organizations who can phone bank 10,000 people that night, or send out to their lists giant lists, emails saying, hey, show up at 6 in the morning. So there's these points of convergence that make sense, but at the same time, really wanting to resist co-optation, because this is not a political movement insofar as it's electorally focused. And that's where I would, I'll hold on that point. So I think community is a really, really important piece, because that's where it gets deep, and it's values-based. And what the left hasn't had is a relationship to faith-based organizations in a really deep way that are doing that day-to-day sustained community building and organizing and touching people's hearts and fulfilling their needs, right? And I think that that's something that actually the public spatial occupations has really contributed to, is actually a place where, yeah, we have a soup kitchen, so to speak. Yeah, the homeless can show up. Like the most marginalized of our society can find resources and community in that place. And space is a really important kind of organizing principle in many ways of Occupy Wall Street, I think, or the Occupy movement in general. You know, one is it provides a destination for a point of entree for absolutely anyone, right? So it's a challenging movement, or movements in general can be challenging to plug into, but at least you know, no matter what, you could show up at a place and you can meet folks and you could kind of learn the lay of the land or participate in a general assembly. I would question a little bit the General Assembly equals the tweet size operationalizing of the tools and so on. I mean, I think in some ways the General Assembly and Zuccotti Park is, one, putting on stage defiance and sacrifice, which captures people's imaginations. And that is something that also is kind of central to historical social movements that we see right now. But two, there is a bit of political theater. Like, it is staging activism, it is staging participation, it is staging democracy, and you know, kind of a social experiment as counterposed to more closed systems behind closed doors, politics as usual, right? Is it idealistic? Of course, yeah. Is it scalable? Perhaps not. But I think it's an important point of entree for folks as they're entering into, for so many people, activism for the first time. So I think, you know, the tools absolutely help with decentralization. There's no bottleneck. We've given people the tools for publishing and promoting, and that allows for and enables rapid response. Currently, I'm working on one initiative that involves engaging arts and culture communities, and just found out last night as we were helping to develop Occupy Art and NYC, .org, that there is Occupy musicians, Occupy writers, Occupy filmmakers, Occupy comics, and OccupyDesign.com. And you go to each site and there's a long list of signatories and folks who are kind of self-organizing within that framework, which I think is kind of amazing, which speaks to another point I wanted to make, which is about the open source brand, right? So I think that that's kind of an important understanding of what's going on here, is that that the brand Occupy Wall Street or Tea Party, et cetera, is contested. Nobody controls that. And that, I love that you said a whole bunch of people showed up with handwritten signs. And one thing that signals is it's coming from lots of different places. And we can manufacture that, and folks have, front groups, et cetera. But it's really authentic in this case. So the idea of the contested name, it's not owned or determined by any kind of hierarchical force, or is it perceived necessarily to be horizontal or equal. It is actually actively contested. It is a battleground. And that is one thing that I would suggest, actually, this notion of occupation, of occupying a name, a symbol, a story, et cetera, is something to think about, and that I think the Tea Party has actually done very well excavating, interpreting, and claiming American history, understanding that history is not a thing of the past, it's of the present and of the future. So there's an active contestation going on. So Occupy is that as well. There are different definitions of what it is. Occupying something and giving it meaning transforms the landscape of occupying different positions within that landscape. So I think finally what I want to say is that That said, while it's a struggle, it's disingenuous to suggest that this all happens online and that it's all leaderless, right? I think one thing that the Occupy Wall Street movement has done effectively is get people for the first time in a long time out of their houses and off their computers. We're moving beyond clicktivism. So, it started out as an occupation of like 50 people, but that really inspired folks, like putting their bodies on the line, doing something courageous, critiquing, at this point, this generation, I heard something, a statistic that suggested that the young generation now has seen the apocalypse in film and popular culture more so than any other, right? We kind of live in a post-apocalyptic movement, and there is not a whole lot of hope out there. If you're a young person and you're trying to get into college and you're saddled with debt, or you've just graduated from college and you're saddled with debt and you live at home with your parents, 60% of college students now live at home with their parents and don't have jobs, right? Every institution has failed them. We've tried electoral avenues, but I think it's obvious that there's no easy solutions that are apparent in that way. So I think movement politics is really the only answer right now. But the focus on the process, the tools, network democracy as a conversation at the expense of defining the ends, I want to problematize a little bit. And that's that, the Occupy movement is a critique of neoliberalism. The last 40 years of an agenda of privatization, deregulation, financialization, in other words, the concentration of wealth, right, and the financialization internationally, and corporate-driven globalization, right? It is an international movement, so, we are not calling for easy reforms. Both parties are the problem. Our political process is poisoned by the influence of money. This is an international movement. From Egypt to Tunisia to Greece to Italy to Spain and the UK, these are all popular uprisings like ours in response to the economic crisis, the cutting of social safety nets, budget cuts, and privatization. Our economic system is broken, and we're going to settle for nothing less than fundamental and structural change, right? And so it's a misunderstanding of power and how power functions in the contemporary age if the solution is an unalloyed faith in decentralization, right? And because at this point, I would argue that power no longer emanates from a centralized closed authority, as it perhaps did decades ago, that now it's been invisibilized and extended. And so our prongs of attack of presenting solutions need to respond to that as well.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we've got two great cleanup hitters to try and weave some of these threads together for us, and also to take us into our second half of the evening of discussion. We're at NYU. I don't think Clay Shirky needs a big introduction. It is his home base. The author of Here Comes Everybody and the Cognitive Surplus, and of many great essays, including A Group is Its Own Worst Enemy, which I couldn't help citing as part of the inspiration for this event. Clay, tell us what you think about the future of network democracy.
Yeah, I actually want to talk a little bit about the way networks and traditional power structures might interact, given the kinds of movements we're talking about and seeing. And the essay Mika referred to, A Group as Its Own Worst Enemy, was an observation that as collaborative groups grow large, they often become self-destructive, or they become bogged down in their own internal politics. I wrote that in 2003, and what I did not understand 8 years ago was exactly what Mark said, which is that a solution that had been adopted by the open source programmers was about to jump out into the larger organizing world. So let me start with a little story of my own. Dan Pfeiffer, a brilliant former student of mine, had written a piece of software that he thought might be useful for the Occupy movement. And so he found some people in the Occupy movement who were working on communications, and he wrote them, and he described the tool, and he said, would this be of some use to you? And they wrote back, and he got back a long, very thoughtful email, but in it was a paragraph that really just jumped out at me, and it said, first of all, you don't really need our permission. And second of all, we're not really sure we could give it to you anyway. Like the people who did OccupyTogether.org didn't ask anybody. They just did it. So maybe just go down to Zuccotti and see if people like it, because if they like it, there's nothing we could do about it. And if they don't like it, there's nothing we can do about it. So maybe that's better, right? So imagine if he'd had an idea for software that might be useful by the United States Department of Transportation. And he'd written to the Department of Transportation, and they said, oh, God, we don't know. Come on down to D.C. and try it. Maybe people will dig it. Who can tell, right? I mean, inconceivable that way of attempting to help the government could be accepted in that way. But when Dan's idea was instead relative to Occupy, they said, really the kind of constraints and permissioning that you imagine are in place really aren't in place, and so you just have to do this kind of in the spirit of things, and if you fail to do it in the spirit of things, frankly, nobody's going to pay you any attention anyway. And that difference, right, the difference in a way between organizations that manage from the top versus organizations that manage from the center, however we characterize those, is a really big deal. Mark, I was really struck by your recounting of something that happens often in open source movements, which is the person that collates the information becomes the person other people naturally go to because they have some sense of where they can get their own questions answered. So both Mark and Beck have referred to the open source movement. One of the earliest observations about open source, dating back from Eric Raymond's seminal paper, Cathedral and the Bazaar from the mid-90s, is that open source software is more modular than its closed source equivalents, which is to say the people working on the spell, excuse me, the people working on the spell checker and the people working on the font rendering actually don't have to talk to each other. The software does a pretty good job of keeping the functions cleaned up enough that those groups can work in parallel. But it took David Eves, the great scholar of open source community, to say, open source software is not more modular because that's good for the software. Open source software is more modular because that's good for the community, right? That the modularity of open source organization is a way of lowering the communications overhead of the people trying to get the jobs done. So what this modularity does, it allows for a massive increase in the number of potential participants, absolutely unheard of scale for people contributing to things like Linux or Firefox, without an equivalent increase in the amount of required management overhead. That's, in a way, the secret that has moved out of the open source movement and into organizing generally. What that technique of modularity allows for is massive collaboration without massive cooperation. And that change is a big part, I think, of the stories that we've been hearing this evening. What that means is, down at Zuccotti, the people doing the signs and the people working on the gray water treatment plant don't have to coordinate with one another. What it means in the Tea Party is that in California, the people running Sacramento and the people running San Francisco don't have to coordinate with one another. They can actually aggregate the lessons after the fact, right? And that distribution of participation at very low cost allows these movements to grow incredibly quickly and allows for an enormous diversity of strategies to be tried out in parallel without having to spend all of that time convincing people that this strategy or that strategy will be better. Anyone who's ever worked in a big organization has sat in that meeting where you've spent so much time talking about whether or not something might be a good idea that you realize you've just expended more energy than you would have expended had you simply tried it. And typically in these kinds of organizations, those kinds of meetings don't happen. So on the list of advantages for collaboration without cooperation, right, here are two things that are not on that list. Enormous clarity of management structure and visible adherence to formal written rules, right? And yet, those are two things that are pretty much the sine qua non of government structure. Right? So one of the open questions that we all face is, some of us face it as activists, some of us face it as observers, but is what are the ways that these new techniques of organizing now around expressly political goals are going to interact with traditional political establishments? And this is assuming success. Obviously, one of the normal cases will just be failure. But assuming these movements succeed, how are they going to interact between insurgent or call them late model social movements and relatively traditional government structure? So one model we've seen already is the protest model, where a group of people come together and they operate in what Pierre Rosanvallon calls counter-democracy. Their main goal is not some affirmative strategy being executed. Their main goal is to get some current situation to simply stop. As Mika sometimes says, these kinds of movements are better at no than go. Right? We have seen quite a few of those. The contemporary situation in both Egypt and Tunis, for example, or Tunisia, for example, are unusual kind of 21st century problems where the answer to the question, who is the new government, is not in fact the people who toppled the old government. Because for the first time, the people who brought down the old government didn't have to look like a government to do the toppling. It was possible to apply enough disintegrating force to a dictatorship without yourself having to be hierarchical. Right? So that's an example of a counter-democratic protest movement that once it achieves its goal of destabilizing a current situation, simply works itself out of business. This seems to have worked out relatively well for the Tunisians. It's worked out relatively badly for the Egyptians because the forces on the ground in those countries that did look like governments and could step into elections were very different, not only from the movements that forced out Ben Ali or forced out Mubarak, but were also quite different from one another. In democracies, elections are simply scheduled insurrections, right? Every now and again, we get to ask, do you want to topple the current government, yes or no? And I think this sort of first model of protest movements work better than governance movements explains the dramatic difference between the way the Obama campaign ran its election, incredibly imaginatively and incredibly open to all kinds of novel inputs, versus the way it is governed, which is a much more traditional model. The second kind of interaction we can imagine between these late model social movements and traditional government is that the kick of networked organizing is a new kind of early phase towards bureaucratization. That these organizations, in as much as they face the same pressures as their forebears, start to bureaucratize around coordination. Something like this, for example, has happened to Wikipedia, where in the old days, anybody could edit any article, but under considerable pressure, Wikipedia has essentially developed a constitutional system of checks and balances. Wikipedia, though much less bureaucratic than Encyclopedia Britannica, is much more bureaucratic than it was, because the pressures on it have caused that kind of adaptation. The Tea Party is an interesting case because it's moved in that direction to some degree because it has involved itself quite directly in electoral politics. The big open question here, I think, is, do you have to go all the way to emulating the previous system, or is there some middle point between the ability of the networked organization to get this kind of distributed participation while at the same time interfacing well with traditional institutions? And then there's the big one. There's the big open question, and it's the one that Ori brought up right at the beginning of this panel, which is it possible, now or ever, for these networked models of coordinating popular activity to alter the way the government itself works? To say, as Iceland did of its constitution, we are actually going to source the intelligence that goes into a constitution in a different way. Now, it says something that there has been almost no national government more desperate to distance itself from its previous history than Iceland. I mean, more than Egypt and more than Tunisia. And so it may be that the answer is only in times of deep crisis will that happen. But I think, and I'll end here, I think this is, in a way, Plan C, as it were, is the really interesting open question. We have almost no examples of it, and yet anybody who looks at the way that these tools are being pressed into service to coordinate large-scale distributed intelligence for the creation of public goods sees something that may apply to government. And I think those three questions, when are these protest movements that work themselves out of a job? When are they early phases to a new sort of bureaucratization? And when do they actually alter the conduct of the governments themselves is one of the big interesting questions for the next couple of years.
All right. So our last speaker is Zeynep Tufekci from the University of North Carolina. She writes a blog called Technosociology, Our Tools Ourselves. And Zeynep graced the PDF stage last June, came to my attention originally for writing what I thought was the single best response to Malcolm Gladwell's, I think, misguided criticism of networking tools as tools for organizing. And Zeynep has been all over this year, including big parts of the Middle East, and I think he's going to bring a bit of an international perspective as well to this conversation, which is absolutely required.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I don't write about Gladwell much anymore. I think 2011 is the answer to him, period. I don't really know what else I can say. See, I really want to discuss some of the where do these movements go and how do they interact with old power question that Clay started talking, partly because I'm really deeply immersed right now in the networks in the Middle East, in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, elsewhere, who are grappling with the next steps kind of questions. And I think just the way that the Egyptians were inspired by the Tunisians, who then inspired the Occupy people, and then Egyptians themselves were inspired and they occupy their own cabinets, and there's this big network of inspiration going on. I think we can learn a lot from each other and also from history to understand. And I was listening to, I was really fascinated by listening to the story, and my Twitter feed was expecting Paul Revere to come up any minute and save the day. But there was one big part missing from your story, which was you guys ran in the primaries. And I think without that step, you might have been a very cute footnote in history, of which I know many. And I don't really want to sort of talk about lots of past things, but I think that's a very important lesson, is that people try again and again and again. This is not a unique thing. It's not like, oh, it happened now and it just created this magic. If you look at the history of Egypt, I can give you 10 examples of similar protests to the January 25. If you want history of Tunisia, I can give you 20. I can talk about so many things like that. If you want to talk about Rosa Parks, I can talk about Claudette Colvin, who did exactly what she did 9 months ago, but was not picked on purpose by the black churches because they thought she would not be a good representative. She was 15 and not as respectable and presentable in Rosa Parks. So a lot of what you read in your history as one person did this and boom, magic happened, is actually a lot of institutional power mixing with new kinds of power, right? Tactical innovation is the history of successful movements. The lunch counter protests are brilliant tactical innovations. The Occupy Zuccotti Park is a brilliant tactical innovation. And tactical innovations all lose their power over time because power figures out how to respond to them, and then it kind of gets boring, and then the attention fades. And then the civil rights movement was brilliant, if you study its history, in finding new tactical innovations when the old ones failed, and confronting power with its new kind of power where power was weakest. And one of the things they did was the power of the image, and taking American values behind them and saying, are you going to beat children and women with your horses and your dogs and your fire hoses? And in the age of television, that was no longer possible. The way in the age of Twitter and Facebook, it's really no longer possible for authoritarian regimes to rule the way they did before. Yes, they can still repress, but not the old way where everybody kind of sat and waited. They can massacre their people. They can try to censor everything. So there's a lot of shift going on. And I want to also say, I'm going to be I want to bring some criticism into this so that we can discuss this, but you have no idea how sympathetic I am to the power of the network argument. I mean, that's what I study. That's what I've been involved in. I'm a former programmer myself, and I talk to lots of people in power all the time, and I tell them all this, and I tell them, your top-down days are over. But I'm kind of lying, because it's not. They're still in power. I tell them that, and I hope to urge them to open up and to reconsider new ways of it. But in the end, if we stop by congratulating ourselves on the healing power of our networks, which they may well have, we are going to have what the Egyptian activists are currently going through, which is they staged another sit-in of Tahrir at the same time Egypt was about to run with elections. And the executive power ran with the elections anyway. And the sit-in completely fizzled. And they weren't able to organize for the elections either. They barely have any representation in the parliament, and that parliament's going to write the constitution. So I'm not saying the protest that Tahrir does not have its power still. It does. But there's also elections that schedule insurrection. I love that line. I am going to steal it from here on. In fact, that's what teachers always do, or speakers. You just steal the good lines when you find them. But that kind of the moment of protest is very powerful. The moment of that kind of collaboration is very powerful. The next question is, how do you take that? And what Tea Party did was actually take its strongest moment to the weakest moment in existing power structures, which are the primaries. Before the word was there, you guys occupied the primaries. I mean, that's the name of what you did in current, 2011 lexicon, is you occupied the primaries to a lot of consequences. So how do you do that without becoming just one more faction, then everything goes back to the way it was? Now, those are really critical, interesting, and not easy questions. I don't have an answer that I can just pull out of my back pocket. But they almost always involve new power and old power intersecting in ways that you didn't really necessarily think when you started all this discussion. And I want to sort of say that from Egypt to, Zuccotti, one thing that I keep seeing is that, and this is a common thing, yes, we're not living under Mubarak, and there's a lot of differences, and yes, our police brutality is pretty bad, but still it's not the same thing as people getting killed. Well, what we're seeing is this huge failure of institutions. We have a failure of institutions from the unions, to the political parties, to all the other institutions that are supposed to do certain things to protect people in particular ways, to regulate things. There's a failure of institutions in terms of where ordinary people are concerned. The mistake would be to think that their failure means that they're irrelevant to you. Because I wanted to, I'm now in University of North Carolina. I was listening to the North Carolina stories, and I'm sort of learning. I just moved there, learning the place. And I wanted to say, they're not coming to rescue you. That's very true. But they are coming for you in many ways. They're there, and they're coming for you. Because you cannot, just because they're not there to help you or improve your life, doesn't mean you can completely turn your back to them and be free of the influence that's going to come anyway. That might not be good. That might be a bank refusing to do mortgage business, the kind of old power we saw. And that would affect the community really badly, and that's been, it's now illegal. What we saw in institutional failure of the regulation of the banking business has plunged the world into a major global recession. And in our country, it's meant people losing homes. It's also is combined with the climate change and other things, is increasing the price of food. And that's no joke, because that's going to push the infant mortality up in poorer countries, right? We lose our homes, they lose their kids. That's kind of the way the global economy works. It's horrific, but that's the truth of it. So I want to sort of talk about how, in the next sort of question and answer, how do use these new tools, which do allow for, I think, very novel, very interesting, very fascinated. Okay, I was going to tell another story, but I'll tell you guys the story of Tahrir supplies. I don't think anybody's followed this, but in the second Tahrir uprising, I've just interviewed these kids, and I call them kids because they're in their 20s, and like kids in their 20s are kids to me now. I'm getting old. I saw this tweet, kind of corner of my eye, saying, well, wait, we're Tahrir supplies. We're going to coordinate the field hospitals. I'm like, what? And here's the setup. There's a couple thousand activists and more coming in, ordinary people coming into Tahrir, and there are fights going on in a street called Mohammed Mahmoud Street, where the police are using tear gas canisters, made in Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. I can't think of a worse way to do diplomacy than that. And they're shooting them like guns at people, and they're shooting rubber bullets at people, and there are thousands of people being injured. And there are field hospitals to take care of these people. But of course, who needs what? At what field hospital? Who's going to go where? And where are the doctors? And what's going on? Right? This is actually the kind of thing that brings down Napoleon and Hitler and everybody that you read about in history. So there's one person, along with his two other 20-something friends, said, why don't we start a Twitter feed to take care of this? Because they didn't really want to do retweets, because when you do a retweet, you don't know how old the request was. And they played with hashtags, and they said, we're going to coordinate this. Okay, fast forward due to time constraints. 5 days later, 17,000 followers, 10 field hospitals, fully stocked, completely accounted for, with 2-hour by 2-hour inventory, so that anything that was extra anywhere else would be moved from place to place, with complete coordination of doctors, nurses, the kind of first aid that was necessary, including where ambulances would need to go in case of more severe injuries. 3 kids, 3 20-some-year-olds with 1 Twitter feed and a couple of Google Docs and a website, and they solved the problem that, got Hannibal stuck in the Alps and Napoleon in Moscow and all of that. And I'm just sort of amazed at watching this happen. And this is no joke. 34 people died in this period. A couple thousand people were injured. So these kids probably saved, maybe a few dozen people's lives, and probably saved a lot of major infections, injuries. I mean, this is happening. I mean, this is not just, I just need some stitches. This is serious, life-threatening. Dozens of people died. So I'm talking to one of them, the founder, and I said, where'd you get the idea? He said, cupcakes. Like, what? He said, there's this cupcake store in Cairo, and they're really successful promoting their business through Twitter. And I thought, if cupcakes can do it, we can coordinate the field hospitals. And I thought, okay, that's one way to look at it. And he thought, it's word of mouth, and they coordinate when they're going to sell the cupcakes and when the Oreo cupcakes are in demand versus not. And I thought, why don't we do that for who needs more, stitching material or betadine? And I thought, actually, you're right. That's not a really bad inspiration. And that was his experience in social media, watching a Cairo cupcake store sell through word of mouth, and he coordinated 10 field hospitals for a week. So this kind of power is, on the one hand, very impressive. So I tell this story to say this is amazing that people can do this. On the other hand, a lot of my friends in Egypt are now thinking, what next? Because they didn't really get up and organize for the elections using this power. They wanted to stay in Tahrir because that's what they knew what to do, and they missed the next moment, which the civil rights movement was very smart in not missing. That the history of civil rights movement is looking and saying, what is next? And it's not always done in the right way. The reasons they chose Rosa Parks over Claudette Goldwyn are not pretty, because the other woman was young and not as good looking and all of that. So I'm not going to sort of just say, it was all perfect. We don't have to replicate their mistakes. But we have to figure out how to combine old and new power. And I'll end with what happened yesterday, just yesterday, with a friend of mine to show you guys how this can get really weird. Alexander Page is the pseudonym of a Syrian activist whose name is now out, Rami. He fled Syria, like within an inch of his life. He had to flee in 3 hours. Somebody warned him, and he just grabbed his baby daughter, infant, and wife, and ran to Egypt. Was traveling to Qatar to participate in a conference. And again, I keep seeing these tweets out of the corner of my eye, and they ruin my day, because then my whole day is this, and it's just a crazy world. And he tweeted, "I'm in Doha immigration, and the bureaucrats here are telling me my visa is blah, 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 not valid, blah, 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 and they're going to deport me back to my country of origin, Syria, where he wouldn't live long enough for us to have a free Rami hashtag. He'd be killed probably instantly." So we all panicked because, you know, I don't know. I'm originally from Turkey, and I am so used to immigration with, you know, just messing something up and saying, "Oh, okay, now we're going to send you back to blah, blah, blah that you've never even seen," and all sorts of stuff, because it's kind of this no man's legal land. And we were really panicking because it's the middle of the night in Qatar, and talking to lots of people, trying to figure out what to do. At that moment, I was thinking, we're trying to really use a 21st century tool, Twitter, to solve a 20th century, quintessential 20th century problem. We have the bureaucratic Kafka who's going to send a man to certain death and torture because he can't get his paperwork in order. So in the middle of the night in Doha, we found someone who found someone, I'm not kidding now, to wake up a Qatari sheikh to go to the airport and go and say, "I am now going to go to immigration and pluck this guy out." So it was 17th century power meeting with 21st century power. I mean, this must have been history's first Twitter dispatch sheikh. You know, so 21st century power dispatched 17th, because that's what we needed. We needed in Qatar at the moment 17th century power, because it was just not going to be taken care of in time through any reasonable method we could come out. And they plucked him out, and he's fine. You know, it's this kind of close call. But that kind of strategic thinking, right? Somebody didn't say, "Oh, I am not going to interact with old kind of power." The question was, how do you interact with old kind of power, but not get co-opted to the degree that you get nothing out of it, but where you imprint your values and where you make a mark or where you make a stance. And the biggest question is what Micha, I'm trying to pronounce it right, but I never get it, it calls the, how do you say go, not just no, and what Clay was saying in terms of how do we go from it's easier to mobilize a unified no, but, and this is not just a social media problem, it's always been more complicated to organize for actual change rather than stopping something bad happening to you. But we live in the kind of world, if we don't figure that out, we're all in big trouble. I apologize to my students all the time, like your generation, sorry guys, you know, we are leaving you with a lot of problems. But and I really would like to discuss not just how great we are with our networks, and I talk about that all the time to lots of people, but how do we then take the next step? And what are the things that we can and cannot do, and how do we do them? And I think that would be great to open up the rest of the discussion to those questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Well, I have to admit, I have been a terrible moderator. This is a case of institutional failure on my part, that I let people speak longer than I said I would. So if the audience wants to chastise me, I'll take my lumps later. But I thought what everybody was saying was so interesting and fresh that it was best to just let it happen. So I'm going to hand things over now to my colleague Andrew Richet, who is going to do his best Phil Donahue Oprah imitation. If you have a question or a comment, raise your hand, and we'll move around as fast as we can. And I'm going to ask the forbearance of our panel maybe to let 2 or 3 people, you know, make a comment or question, and then very short answers.
So just a couple of quick points on top of that. I was watching the Twitter feed. Just to remind everybody, this is not an event to compare the merits of Occupy Wall Street versus the Tea Party or political movements or for political pontificating. We're here to analyze what dynamics work in the way networks are formed and what we might think about going forward. What are the commonalities? What are the dynamics that can help us understand this for anybody's purposes, not just one particular political point of view? So I'm reminding you of that. Secondly, please identify yourself. We're trying to keep it short. And I'm going to just sort of picking up on Tefeki's challenge, I want to just add my own 2 cents to this, which is that I believe that organized minorities are always more powerful than disorganized majorities, that works in history, whether it's the 17th century government or the 21st century government. And if we can understand that dynamic better, maybe we can go back and fix some of the institutional prerogatives that have gotten us into this mess in the first place. So who wants to start? Okay, please identify yourself.
Hi. Okay. I just want to give thanks to you guys for organizing this. You know, a year ago, we were all gathered over on the East River talking about WikiLeaks, which curiously, wasn't mentioned. And just to add some sort of meaty critique for the panelists to talk about, the network and all of the social parallelism that allows is still controlled by companies. So WikiLeaks can't get funded because the very organized global neoliberal order has blocked a large number of pathways for them to be funded. So how do we make the type of change that we want to make, or that we're celebrating and patting ourselves on the back for, when the network itself is highly privatized and not truly that open?
Does anybody want to pick up that?
Didn't Mika say go?
Take a few more.
Okay.
It's Dan Latore.
Dan Latore, I'm here independently.
Thanks. Gideon Litchfield from The Economist. So I'd like to pick up on Zainab's question and put that to as many people on the panel as want to answer it, which is what is next in terms of that nexus of new power with old power? For the Occupy movement, one might ask, what are your primaries? What might the thing be that is equivalent to the Tea Party as running in the primaries? And for the Tea Party movement, it's, well, what comes after that? And in particular, seeing the Republican Party implode at this stage, where is the next point at which new power can insert itself into the weak point in old power?
Hi, I'm Harry Wastebrand. I'm an organizer with the Job Party, and a lot of our focus has been on Wisconsin since the uprising and occupation of the Capitol there last spring. But I think one thing that really plays into this a lot is what Mika has been saying in terms of the how do you go and not just say no movement. We have a case study developing there in terms of actually putting that into practice, in terms of recalling these political leaders that had instituted this suppression of what people in Wisconsin consider their very freedom. Collective bargaining there is just considered a hard-fought-for right that people very literally lost their lives for. And I think that it's going to be a model that is going to be shown moving forward in terms of everything from Occupy, in terms of how these movements are able to impact elections even though they're above the electoral. And I think it's disconcerting that Wisconsin has been forgotten on panels like these already, considering we had over 100,000 people in the street last February, and in New York City, of all places, we've yet to break 30,000. I think that's telling.
We'll take one more, and then we'll get from the panel some comments.
Hi, I'm Gilad Lotan from Social Flow in New York. I wonder what kind of terminology we need to think about when we talk about networks. Like, it's not about belonging to a group, but it's this loose affiliation to an idea, right? So do we need to be thinking about tie strength? Like, how related are you to the idea of Occupy or to the Tea Party? What are hubs in the network? Somebody said that there's no bottlenecks in the networks, but there actually can be. And what does it mean when the network grows too wide or too thin? Does it thin out? Is there no sort of hub within the network?
Anybody want to comment from those series of questions from the panel? Any thoughts that come out there? Please, Mark, go ahead.
You know, Zaina brought up primaries, and while I really appreciate the credit, we didn't engage in the primaries previously. And if you look at 2010 and you look at, we had the sweeping electoral change, it was the largest change of parties since 1938. Does anybody have any idea how many incumbents in the House of Representatives, all of them are standing, right? How many lost their seats in 2010? Incumbents in the primaries? 4. 4. That was a historic increase of 33%. The historic average is 3. So it's a fake fight in the primaries, and I think Zane is right. That is where the game is, and that's where we should all be playing together. Because the reality is, unless we disrupt the power structure by turning out incumbents, unless we do that within the party structure, we will ultimately fail to reform the institutions. It's a fake fight in the primaries, and in the reality is, for all of us, even in the general election, 78 to 80% of districts are fixed. You live in a Democratic or a Republican district, it's the way it is, no matter what you believe. And so we have to take the fight to the primaries. There's actually an organization called Alliance for Self-Governance, nonpartisan, and they're running something called the Campaign for Primary Accountability. The goal is to turn out 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans in the primaries. Think about that. Now that's radical disruptive change.
Yeah, so I'm going to just take the moderator's prerogative and throw one bone on the table to answer this, which is, while I'm all for throwing out incumbents, the problem is that in order to say no to an incumbent, you often have to say yes to someone who's even worse in terms of creating this two-party, you reinforce the two-party polarization, right? And what we actually need is something that is almost impossible to get, given how the rules are written for ballot access as well as gerrymandering, which is we need a third party that's independent of both. And so while I would love new blood and the potential that those new people aren't immediately captured the way they often are, the pressure is to conform within one party's hierarchy. It's very, very intense. I'm sure the Tea Party members of Congress would admit to that now. And what we lack is that third piece that can disrupt the two-party duopoly. Go ahead, Becca.
Well, I want to speak to this go versus no, because I feel like to a degree it represents a misunderstanding of a social movement versus a political or electoral movement. What I see happening with Occupy, there's a lot of criticisms of what are your demands, why don't you get into running folks in primaries, et cetera, is, it depends on how you're defining the problem, right? Occupy came to be as a movement inspired by other uprisings this year and recognizing and understanding a connection to them, that there is a common denominator. And that also, because of a time of crisis, actually the tactic of occupation, there was a new school occupation 3 years ago, and it spread to NYU and then to the West Coast and was very successful in California. There was an occupation of a factory by labor in Chicago. There's networks of folks that have been working in activist ways that are outside of institutions, for a long time. But I think the thing is, it kind of catches fire now because of crisis. And if you define the problem, I'm going to say the word capitalism, an ideology of the cancer cell, unlimited growth in a finite system, leads to the concentration of wealth. So I would challenge the notion that elections are scheduled insurrections, and that Egypt is a failure because it hasn't succeeded in pushing elections forward in this moment. There's a lot of activists on the ground. There's another revolution in Egypt right now by people who don't want to see the same regime in a different face, beholden to the same interests installed right now, right? So elections are not insurrections if you're not actually changing the rules of the game. Right, and changing the rules of the game is not just like a third party, right? It's the influence of money in politics. And what's next? I mean, I think a social movement functions to tilt the political playing field, to change the conversation, to shift the terms of the game. And then, groups with pointy-ended campaigns and very specific demands find that they gain new traction against a new backdrop.
All right.
Marianne, you wanted, I think Marianne wanted also, go ahead, yeah.
And in particular, in solidarity with my Wisconsin brothers there. I think Wisconsin was a game-changing situation very much, and you see a lot of people having the narrative of what was possible. You know, there was a morning that we were up all night, right? And we came to the park here in New York City, after the park had been taken, and somebody said, we need breakfast. And they said, well, we could get pizza in Wisconsin. The store opens at 6:20. Can we feed 1,000 people breakfast in the next 20 minutes? And we did, and like everyone tweeted, and we knew that it was a Wisconsin moment. So in some ways, it's so embedded in our bodies, some of the ways and things that happened there, but you're right, it should have been mentioned. I'm also, though, when I think about Wisconsin, I think about the comment you made about the control, right, of the internet, because I'm aware of what the cost, the financial cost to fight, that governor's fight. I donated to it. I know the numbers. And so when I think about movements that are citizen-powered, and I think about the institutions and the organizations, particularly the unions that came in and the level of expenditures that were there to make that point, I am also really aware of what that is, and that we can't fight that fight in, 22 places, really, at the same time when people are being foreclosed on. And it breaks my heart in that way, and so I'm left with this question about it. And in the same way, I'm left with the question, like, we don't have the money to run the new Facebook. Everyone talks about it, and everyone talks about getting off Facebook, or, we don't have one that's owned by progressives. We all talk about building it, but it's not like there's not somebody who's a billionaire who steps up and says, here you go, build it, it's free, now have it. So I'm constantly aware of these, I think, places that we're trying to both build and take victories that are within larger systems that actually we're not controlling, or that cost levels of money that we don't have access to, and that the little stories I was telling about community, those people in North Carolina who came together and now they're holding their elected official accountable, or they're asking for jobs out of the DNC. They're doing small things, but it's still remaining within their control. And that thing that we're looking at is, how do we scale that power and take it on? And I think there are some real challenges within it that we don't have any answers to right now.
Okay, one more comment from Ori.
I think that we're missing something here. Mark, that story about getting in your pickup truck and not really thinking about whether it was primary time or anything else, I take that at face value, and I think there's something incredibly strong here. I think that asking what's next, while a very interesting question, doesn't give us patience, doesn't acknowledge the fact that there is emergence. I'm working with the Army. It's a top-down organization. And if the Army wanted to today, it can take over this entire room and can dispose of us. There's no question that top-down organizations have power. But take a couple of considerations. For the last 10 years, the Army has fought a distributed, decentralized organization. And how much real progress have they made? This is the second year in a row that more soldiers have killed themselves to suicide. More soldiers have committed suicide than died in combat. And I want to offer you a story. For a second, don't close your eyes, but think of the 3 people who are closest to you. Just think about them for a second. And think about what emotions come up. Maybe it's your mother, a lover, a brother, a friend. I want to tell you about this guy named George who mentored another kid in West Point. He was an older soldier. He mentored a younger kid. The kid ended up marrying George's daughter and goes to Afghanistan. And his second month there, he walks on a landmine and instantly loses both of his legs. And George is devastated, and his daughter doesn't know what she's going to do with her life. And the people that he turns to are the people that he sat with in a circle. It's not his family. It's not people he served with. It's this connection. And I think that unless we really acknowledge the power of connection, yes, we all want power, we all want sex, money, and a bunch of things, but one thing I can guarantee you is all of us in this room want connection. And what emerges from connection can't be predicted. It can't be put into a chart. Really, it's one of these things of true emergence.
So one of the riches that PDF has is it has amazing people in its network, people in the room. There are dozens of people here who could easily be on stage. So I can't pick on everybody, but there is one gentleman who has joined us today that I do want to ask, because if we had more time, we'd have him on his panel. So Don Tapscott, who's been writing about networks for a long time, is here, and I'm going to just invite him to say a few words.
Thanks. it's been a really good discussion. I just wanted to try and parse it out and actually add a new topic. This discussion started off talking about the role of networks in achieving social change, new network models, emergence, starfish, and for sure the internet drops transaction and collaboration costs of dissent and of organization. A second topic is, what is the nature of government itself, and how does the internet change that? And for sure, I think we're in the early days of a profound change to sort of the deep structure and architecture of governments and how we sort of orchestrate capability in society to create public value. In the old models that governments do everything inside and they collect tax dollars and deliver services back to citizens, and we can now move to a new division of labor in society about public value. A third one has to do with how do these movements intersect and interact with these existing structures. And if you want an extreme case in point, you look at the Arab Spring. I mean, you know that up until a year ago, throughout all human history, revolutions had a leader. And when the old regime fell, there was a leadership to take power. And these things happen so quickly that it leaves a vacuum. And that's a big problem. Well, I don't know if we're going to achieve a mass, insurrection in the United States, but for sure, something short of an actual insurrection, there are big questions there. The fourth one that hasn't really been discussed is really interesting to me is what does network democracy look like as an institution? And the Beatles song that I never liked was Revolution. And I hated that line, you say it's about the institution, you want to free your mind instead. And sure, we all got to free our minds, but you know what? It's about the institution. It's called state power. And we have a state, we have an old industrial age model of the state and of democracy. And just like mass production or mass distribution, mass marketing, mass education, mass democracy was the centralized, powerful forces push something out to passive recipients. And the first kind of era of democracy, we created these representative institutions, but there was a weak public mandate and an inert citizenry. I think we can now move to a whole second era of democracy based on a culture of public deliberation and active citizenship where people are engaged in the whole process. And if you think about it, I mean, we have all these institutions. The one I was just with today was on education, the old model of pedagogy. I'm a teacher, I have knowledge, you're a student, you're an empty vessel, you don't get ready, here it comes. You're passive, you're recipient of what I've got. Well, I'm a politician. Listen to this 30-second negative ad where I attack my opponents around an issue that, as a young person, you could care less about. Then you go vote, and then I'm going to broadcast to you for 4 years, and then we're going to get to do it all over again. Actually, that's not quite accurate, because over that 4 years, I'll be broadcasting you, but mainly I'm going to be spending my time raising money from the lobbyists who control things, which is, by Clay, I agreed with everything you said, but I think that elections are a planned insurrection needs work, because that's a big problem right now for a lot of young people. They figure whoever you vote for, it doesn't matter, because the lobbyists are still going to control what goes on in Congress, and you're not achieving real change. So this is a whole, maybe another topic, but what does a new network model of democracy in terms of the institution actually look like?
Anybody else want to comment from the audience? Here, there, as I get there, I just want to answer you, which is that if you ask the politician what network democracy is, they'd say it's e-government. But what we're studying is something different. We call it we-government, because people are going to be building the tools that actually solve people's problems in their civic lives and their personal lives themselves. They're not going to wait for government or any politician to do it. And there'll be a new fabric that's going to rise up that's going to completely replace the old one. So I think the problem is that we're constantly looking to the existing institutions to sort of adjust and change, when in reality they're dinosaurs and they're extinct as they walk. So we have to support we-government, not e-government, and maybe we'll have a better chance at building a new democracy. This gentleman right here.
Thank you indeed to the organizers for organizing this. My name's Phil Grome, and I'm a first-year graduate student at ITP. The gentleman just before me took the words straight out of my mouth. The whole debate was about the future of network democracy, and we've been talking a lot about network activism, and it almost seems to me that the future of network democracy implies that you don't need any more activist movements because the network democracy allows the citizen to engage directly with a government institution. And so perhaps one way of looking at these networked activist movements is to look at them as examples of platforms that perhaps government can look to in the future for how to engage a citizenry and get people motivated and educated around important issues.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to invoke James Madison and Federalist Papers number 10, echoing what Andrew said earlier about organized minorities versus disorganized majorities. We've seen in two different occasions now, one change.gov and one the more recent e-petition stuff, that whenever the American people are asked what is the number one issue that should be on the president's desk, it turns out to be medical marijuana. Right? That's the, you know, I know that there's some financial stuff going on, maybe a couple wars, but really, really, the thing that Obama should be working on now is medical marijuana. And the problem there isn't that the war on drugs is not problematic. The problem is that the mechanism by which the American people is surveyed in that case, the platform, necessarily privileges the people who are the most organized and the best at getting this kind of participation. And what, you know, I'm invoking Madison to say is, no matter how open the platform is, there is a deep democratic structural problem in preventing both majoritarian and minoritarian classes of tyranny that involve accepting that human beings will organize into factions and that government is not the thing that calms the factions. Government is the place where the factions contend. So even in as open a platform as we can develop and have, we are still going to need rules that constrain the factionalization to whatever we consider as a group to be a fair fight, which is what went into the design of the second, which is to say our current Constitution. So as much as we've lowered the, you know, I like me some social software, fine, right? But as much as it lowers the transaction and coordination costs for groups, it doesn't get us out of the basic dilemmas of political philosophy. It just gives us a new context in which we have to take them on.
Clay, I want to ask you a follow-up question. Leaving aside that Wikipedia has become a little more institutionalized, bureaucratized, why couldn't Congress operate under the neutral point of view approach to writing a bill, which is to say the bill doesn't pass unless the two sides agree on the same method that opposing sides have to agree on the language of a Wikipedia article? Is that impossible?
I mean, you know, setting aside the congressional design, whether or not you could get there from here, given the current structure of Congress, what I will say is that neutral point of view is a card that is played not to exemplify a measurably neutral point of view, but rather to say, this is precisely Wikipedia's way of dealing with faction. I think in a way this is an answer to Phil's question, which is Wikipedia has embedded as much a cultural norm as anything right now, this notion that neutral point of view is a way that we solve these kind of factional fights rather than ignoring them. I like all kinds of ideas for writing congressional bills better than I like our current system. I don't know whether or not that one could work, even if it could be implemented. But I think it's another example of no matter how open the system, factionalization is a separate class of problem from access and platform.
Can I have to jump. I'm sorry, Wikipedia. Have you been on the discussion pages lately? I don't know, but I'm a pretty sort of comfortable with argument kind of person. I argue all the time on all sorts of platforms, but I Wikipedia, I just sort of dipped my toe in and I thought this is too high conflict for me. It is one of the most high conflict environments you can find for anything that's contested. And by no coincidence, about 90% of the contributors are men. It's a high conflict environment and the loudest get their way. And they have very nice ways of figuring out how to get a good product out of it anyway. But you have to realize that kind of high conflict environment will necessarily discourage certain kinds of participation. As a result, if you look at sort of wide-scale studies of it, stuff that is of interest to the kind of people who are high conflict, there are lots and lots of entries about them. And it's like male stuff, you have tons of, like, every kind of car you can imagine. If you look at the other end, there isn't. It's just, and I'm not necessarily saying Wikipedia has a lot to teach to us.
I withdraw my Wikipedia suggestion.
Exactly. So I'm sorry. The other thing I want to say is, like, I really don't want to say there is, we should just go vote in elections and that's it, and elections are not at all. What I'm saying is that a lot of times things that look structureless, they have structure. There's a famous essay from the 60s, The Tyranny of No Structure. It means the loudest get to speak. And Gilad was trying to raise this. Networks tend to be hierarchical. Open networks, things like Twitter, things like blogs, tend to generate hierarchies very quickly. This is a very well-studied thing. And I think there are brilliant things in the way the General Assemblies are run, but if you think it doesn't privilege the facilitators and it doesn't discourage certain kinds of person from speaking, that would be wrong too. Now, that doesn't mean we abandon what's good about it, but if we're just sort of blind to everything you set up, there's going to be these age-old political philosophies that Clay is talking about, the tyranny of the minority versus the tyranny of the majority. And technology is going to change the game, but it's not going to change the question. You cannot just wish away these questions. We should discuss how can we better deal with them with all these new tools. And just sort of to close on the Wisconsin thing, I think Wisconsin was, I was saying kafaya, but it's our Iran moment. I talk to a lot of people in the Middle East who tell me Iran taught us how to do this. And I've heard this from, I had a lot of friends in Wisconsin, so I was kind of involved in spirit. And they called me and said, we're not as good as the Tahrir people. Tell us what they did. And I said, I don't know, but get a router? They didn't have routers in the capital. But the thing about Wisconsin that worked to a degree was to change the conversation that Becca is talking about. That's a very powerful effect. There are studies that show people now, the press has stopped its discussion of, say, the fiscal debt, and now talking a lot also about jobs, unemployment, inequality, those kinds of things. So those are very powerful. But history is full of movements like this failing without improving the lives of the people for the better. There are many attempts that do not go someplace. Just because you have good values and good organizations doesn't mean there's some historical, God who's going to come down and say, there you win. So I think the questions are still important for us to consider.
All right, I just wanted to come out a little here. In addition to doing labor organizing, I've run a lot of political campaigns. I ran 9 states for the Obama campaign, and I'd want to tackle some of the political questions about Occupy Wall Street. And the first, I think I just need to look at what the Obama campaign did right, and then what the Obama, not the administration, but the party and OFA did so wrong, was that there were all these people. I mean, the list that the Obama campaign put together is the best list in history. That is not a list that would demand medical marijuana. That is a list that is truly representative, that is deep in all kinds of communities across this country and around the world, because we had to keep refusing money from foreigners. But that list was amazing, and I'd never been a real big Dean person, but if Dean had been put in charge of the Democratic Party after that election, that list might have really built the democracy. It might have built a party. It might have allowed people a place to engage in the election. It might have, it might have helped Obama's presidency. It might have changed the way he governs. Instead, it was this weak echo chamber where they couldn't be one step to the left or one step to the right of anything the president said. And the place I saw that most viscerally was in healthcare reform. The day that Obama came out and said, look, I don't think we're going to have the public option, there was all these forums around the country of OFA, and their message was, we don't need the public option. SEIU came out that same day and said, it's all right if we don't have a public option. And it was just it was a collapse. That should have been the moment where people threw him against the wall and said, we demand a public option. And he should have said, look at these crazy people. What am I going to do? I have to give somebody a public option. But that didn't happen because that movement was you know, their legs were cut off like immediately after the election. And Occupy is doing the opposite. Occupy is changing the space. Occupy has already changed the conversation. It's changed the conversation in New York. It's changed what the president is saying pretty radically. It's changed the constituency people think that they have to speak to. And I am somebody who's run so many political elections, asked so many people to vote, knocked on so many doors, gotten so many people to do that. And I hope that Occupy doesn't do that. I hope that Occupy, at least not for a long time, doesn't engage that way in electoral politics, that they continue to push the conversation, they continue to shift the ground, they continue to like expand our political imagination, and like they let the politicians try to work it out amongst themselves and come to us and figure out, you know, what, like, how to speak to the 99%.
Jessica, we're going to get back. Thank you. We're going to get back to the questions. The way I always frame that problem with Obama is that when he got elected, he used the word "we," and before he got elected, he used the word "we," and when he got elected, he switched to using the word "I."
And your excellent reporting on that, Mika.
All I was going to say is that I'm now coming to the view that the 2008 election was to the left what the Iran model was to the people in Tahrir. Okay, back to the...
Please identify yourself, and we're going to take a couple questions more.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Vanderveen. I'm just an independent. But I was really active in the term limits movement in the early mid-'90s across the western states. And, you know, a couple big lessons we learned. It had broad-based support, 75%. We had everyone from Jerry Brown to Newt Gingrich working with us at different times. But I think the big key was we focused. And even though it was very distributed, we focused on a single issue and didn't let people get sidetracked. And I think with the difference between Tea Party and Occupy at this point that I see is there doesn't seem to be much focus with the Occupy movement, at least in terms of a platform or an idea that everyone gets behind and supports and drives. I think there's plenty of ways to change structure in America. The ballot initiative process is a fairly strong process in 22 states, but it requires doing something and doing something really proactively and effectively. And I'm wondering if you can address, the Tea Party seems to be proactive in a primary process, at least to some degree. I'm wondering if the Occupy movement, in terms of a next step or next generation, has any interest in getting involved in ballot initiative process, or if there's some focused political activity to change structure that they might be interested in.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Talia Haggerty. I'm an NYU grad student. And I want, Becca, what you said about not overemphasizing the means and forgetting the ends. I hear that caution, and I think it's really important. But I want to push back on it a little bit and hear from the rest of the panel what you guys think. The biggest thing that I've learned in Zuccotti Park and being in other Occupy Wall Street events is that there's something wrong with the way that we do things, everything, the way that we talk to each other. And Occupy meetings are sometimes breaking down because the people don't understand the process and they're still learning the process. And it's really hard. But when people walk away from Zuccotti Park, they do things differently in their classrooms and in their workplaces and in the way that they communicate with each other. And I want to raise this in absolute poking fun, no disrespect meant at all to all the men who've asked questions before me, but this wasn't exactly a progressive stack. So I'm wondering if the means are the ends. And it relates to the political question too. You know, I got out in the streets for Obama. I knocked on doors in 3 states. I hugged strangers in Grant Park the night that he won. And his presidency has been an abysmal letdown. You know, this isn't, a lot of people feel like this is the first time Americans have been in the streets for a long time, you know, starting in Wisconsin. It's not. We got in the streets for Obama, and it didn't work. So now we're getting in the streets in a different way. So I just, you know, I'd like to ask you that question. Are the means the ends? Thanks.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Because I'm actually going to take one more and then ask the panel to sort of make their last comments.
I'm John Bashir. The funny thing about that Gladwell piece was that everyone was arguing about whether he made strong arguments about like whether the tools matter or not. But the thing he kind of snuck into the beginning was the description of the nature of the movement in Birmingham, and that it took millions of dollars and lots of organizing and sacrifice from the participants who had jobs and had to sort of decrease the efficiency of their lives for a year in order to put all this pressure on these institutions, and the institutions had to feel that pressure. You know, and the thing he was asserting with that is that there are some things in this world that, you know, it's worth challenging the status quo, pissing off politicians and the media. And that was kind of taken as accepted by everyone who disagreed or agreed with that article, is that those premises were accepted, which you usually don't see in the mass media. The premise that that kind of dissent and protest is sort of a natural and you know, right thing to do. So I just thought that was interesting, and you know, I wonder if that like weaved its way into like the way people think about these movements and respect dissent. Sort of, but at the same time, and I'm almost done. But it's you know, whenever whenever politicians or the media you know, say we don't know what Occupy wants, what that means is we know exactly what they want, but we don't want to articulate it because that'll give them power. So, and I'm sure you know, some parts of the Tea Party see similar lack of representation of their actual ideas. So. You know, that's kind of a big deal. Like, we're facing this situation where, you know, there's millions of people who have this sort of resistance to the status quo, and the media is kind of like not representing them well at all, and the politicians are ignoring them. You know, that's not just like, you know, are we going to integrate schools or not? And then, like, with enough pressure, it happens. That's kind of like, you know, big parts of the system need to change, and the people and the media and the politicians know that, you know, their jobs are at stake if it does change. And that, I don't know, so I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
So, everyone gets a last whack. We'll work our way in this direction. So, but very, very brief, 1 minute, and this time I'm going to be a tough moderator.
Oh,
okay.
So I go first? Okay.
You're standing in the way between us and drinks and dinner.
Oh, no. Okay. So I want to end with a little anecdote from a campaign to get a certain coffee chain, Starbucks, to carry fair trade coffee. And the campaign deliberately at some point split itself into the guys who wore the suits. It was mostly guys. And the ones that stayed outside, and the people who went in with their suits and well-dressed, whatever, clothes, told the Starbucks people, if you don't carry fair trade, I really can't tell you what these crazies would do to your stores. It's just not us, you know, but they're kind of crazy out there. And it was about a week of that Starbucks started carrying fair trade coffee, just about. So maybe all the points kind of come there. Maybe the question isn't, you know, is Occupy going to run or not? And maybe what you're saying, Jessica, is absolutely right. That in fact, there's no Occupy to make that decision. And there's a big change in the conversation that is really powerful. And it is not for this person or that person.
And
but
time's up.
That has to end with a political change at some point. Yeah.
Great.
Given the political representation of the panel, I'm going to donate my minute to Mark.
So speaking to the focus on process or network democracy without the other piece of the puzzle, to me it's a conflation of form and content, means and ends, and that misses the point of Occupy Wall Street or this social movement, and really of most social movements. One, to speak to, you know, it invisibilizes power, right? The General Assemblies, I'd like to see them everywhere. They should multiply. We should bring more people into the conversation, absolutely, and invigorate our democracy. But at the same time, it does, you know, that's the tyranny of structuralistness. It does privilege certain voices, and it does mean that decisions get made outside of those forums, and that's invisible. And it's the illusion of democracy, which I think is the status quo, and the problem right now is that we have the illusion of democracy, and when in actuality our politicians are bought and paid, you know, and bought and sold, or paid for, whatever, and the influence of money in politics and of lobbyists and of Wall Street. And this whole stop and go thing and what are you guys going to do? It's not focused. It's called Occupy Wall Street for a reason. There is a focus on a critique of our economic system and the influence of money and financialization internationally. And so I think that we have to, at this point, think about the 99% versus the 1%. It's in the frame right there, and that it's not about short-term demands. It's about expanding the political imagination.
Great, thank you. Mark,
So
you get 2 minutes.
Oh, lucky me. Lucky you guys, right? One Tea Partier. I think the critical point, and this question's been asked a bunch of times, is the intersection of the existing power structure with this new challenge to that power structure. And I think that is the most difficult place. It's I think, the threshold that has yet to be crossed. It certainly hasn't been crossed in the Tea Party movement. You guys might argue there's a Tea Party caucus. I don't know who those people are, how they appointed themselves as the Tea Party caucus. Honestly, I went there for that press conference where they introduced themselves to make damn clear that they weren't us and that they didn't speak for us, and that they didn't represent us, but if they wanted to use the name Tea Party, then they were going to be accountable to us. And frankly, in that regard, we have not succeeded. And we have watched some people in our own movement be co-opted by the power structure. It's awful sexy. You know, people get invited to parties and they're sitting in meetings in John Boehner's office, or, you know, they're inside the power structure. And when you've never been in there, when we've been excluded as citizens for all these years, sometimes it's very shiny and sparkly. And it's easy to get co-opted by that structure. And people who get co-opted don't believe that they're co-opted. They believe that they're inside and they're doing what's right and just for the movement. So I think that intersection where we conflict with power, where we're trying to change the power structure, where we ourselves are engaged in that power structure and trying not to be corrupted by it, I think that's the critical threshold. I can tell you that we as a movement have yet to cross. I hope that people in this room, people in the Tea Party movement will cross that threshold together.
Hear, hear.
Wow. All right. Jessica.
I mean, I want to speak to a moment about democracy. We kind of throw that word around and we use it as if like that's still the dominant political system we have. And I really think, and I'm not somebody who's traditionally a conspiracy theorist on this stuff, but Citizens United gutted that, like gutted the remnants of that. Like the power that corporations have to contribute from their general treasury secretly is the reason that Rubin and Summers continued to run financial policy after a man who was elected because the economy had collapsed promised to do something different. We handed it off to the same people that created the problems because there's so little room up there. Like there really is a ton of control. And so our ability to get new candidates, to have the candidates we used to like do the kinds of things we think they should, is so limited by how much money is out there and how little of that is controlled by us. So we really need the kind of sea change. We really need the kind of shifting of the ground to begin to, like, you know, fight back. I mean, it really is a plutocracy. And democracy really is, like, on the edge and on the way out. Like, if something dramatic, much more dramatic than voting, like, doesn't change.
Thank you. Marianne.
So I want to speak both risk and hope. So the risk of Occupy, Deanna Zant tweeted, there was an enormous amount of violence against women and a lack of people of color's voices within what was built in Zuccotti Park. And what we know is that anytime a network comes together, that it will reflect where it was born out of. And there was a lot of discussion about that, about people coming and saying, in the park, we're creating the 1% whose voices are being heard here. And we don't have real answers to that. But the hope for me actually lies in the question you asked, which is what's the link between activism and democracy? And I have to look back to etymology about what does the word democracy actually mean, and it really means common people, district, rule, and strength when you break it down in the Latin and the French. And I think we forget that what the evangelical churches know, which is that you need to meet people where they are and take them through a developmental stage of engagement, right? And so when I look at the anti-slavery movement that took on the largest economy in Britain and won, it was made up of small circles of trust, of people who knew each other with shared values. They were Quakers. Those living room meetings got them prepared to do something that was distinctly different. And from that space, they were able to do a systemic shift. So I think that the link between trust and activism and shared values and that developmental model is one that we don't often think about and see. We think people are just going to all of a sudden show up in democracy and participate in a particular way. But we have to walk through that in our social change networks so that when people get to a particular space, our ability to break through in these other systems is inherent in our circles and in who we are.
With Ori, we're going to finish with Ori.
You from NYU, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think you hit it on the nail. And the question I have for you guys is, think about it seriously. How many circles do you belong to? How many circles? And it's nice to say, oh, other people should do that. And circles are messy, and they bring out weird people, and they talk about process, and you want to be done with it. But the bottom line for me is to trust in the process. Because that same process, that very simple, I don't know if it's 17th century or if it's 1st century, has changed the world time and again. Alcoholics Anonymous, the women's suffrage movement, the anti-slavery movement. And I hate to use this as a positive example. The reason we're here in this room is because a network of terrorists did something horrible in New York, and they used the exact same process. The process works. It's messy, but we have to trust it.
All right. Well, I hope this has been food for thought. Certainly, it's been a very provocative and interesting evening. We're going to, this entire event, we've been live streaming it. It's actually going to be archived on our website at personaldemocracy.com. We'll continue the conversation around the hashtag PDMTOWS. And we invite you also to engage with us online at personaldemocracy.com and techpresident.com. And we'll see you here in June 11th and 12th for the 8th Annual Personal Democracy Forum Conference. And Andrew will take us out. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you, everyone. Really, really appreciate it. Just one last thing, which I just want to make a case for. PDF has always been based on the fact that we are trying to build a community that believes that technology and technology innovation can build a more transparent, more open, more collaborative, more deliberative government. And I actually, to tell you the truth, am completely shocked that we didn't have more people in the audience here who identified themselves with the Tea Party. And I just want to just say one thing to Mark, which is, Mark, when you say you represent the Tea Party, what I see is not someone who represents the Tea Party. I see an American. And I thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us. So it's not about voting. It's about civic participation. See you in June. Thank you for coming.